Good morning. The reading is from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are a people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. This is the word of the Lord.
So Harvard University did the longest study that they ever put together was over the course of 90 years to try to find what was the number one predictor of a happy and healthy life. And over 90 years, what do you think it is that they found? It was the quality of their relationships. It was their community. So if you wanted to live a longer, healthier, happier life, you needed to invest in one thing, and that would be community. Might not be surprising for a lot of us that if you are experiencing a lot of loneliness or isolation, that does not lead to mental health, and it ultimately leads to living a shorter lifespan from what Harvard found. And many of us might be experiencing some of that even now, right? Which is why people are often now turning to what in order to find community? Artificial intelligence. You know, chatbots are the fastest rising, largest use case right now for AI because people want relationships and companionships. We know that we need it, and we're turning to AI for that. There was a recent study that found that 72% of current US teenagers, 72%, are using AI chatbots for companionship. Because just think about it, it is so much easier to process your emotions when there is no vulnerability, when there is no conflict, and they'll just listen to you and tell you what they want. And so AI chatbots are really giving and sort of filling the void that our human needs have. Right? This need for companionship and for relationship. But guess what studies continue to find? That those who are using AI for companionships and relationships are found to be more lonely, more isolated, because now human relationships become that much scarier to invest in and to move toward. And so the cure that this world is giving us is actually accelerating the disease. We're in this season where we're looking at our vision and our values, our gospel DNA, the thing that sets our community apart and the thing that's now animating our community. We've been saying that we want to be a church not for ourselves, but for the good of Brooklyn. Right, that as the gospel comes in and transforms your life, it doesn't stay there. It's not just a private spiritual matter, but the gospel is always moving outward into our community lives, into our shared lives here in Brooklyn. And so you haven't deeply understood or internalized the gospel. It hasn't totally transformed you if it just remains in your heart. The way that you know that you've understood and that you were living out the gospel is that it will inevitably and always send you and put you in a radical new gospel community. That is how you know that the gospel is becoming operative in your life. And that's what we're going to look at today. Community is not just this deep spiritual human need, but the Bible and 1 Peter is going to tell us that this is incredibly God's plan, not just to meet our human needs, but for his ultimate purposes of healing and renewal in the entire world. That there are a lot of people who are isolated and in need and in darkness, and the church, God's community, is his main plan, his vehicle to bring about healing and redemption and renewal to the rest of the world. That's what we get to be a part of, and that's what 1 Peter is going to teach us. 1 Peter is like this incredibly rich, beautiful passage that helps us to understand a couple of unique things about Christian community in particular. And we're going to look at three things that 1 Peter talks about. First, that Christian community in particular has a very distinct and unique identity, also a distinct and unique calling. And And then finally, the power to live into that calling and into that identity. So let's look at those three things this morning as we look at our need for community. Now, I want us to look closely at what Peter is saying about the church, or who Christian community particularly is. Look with me starting in verse 9. He says this: "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." Now that sounds really marvelous. That sounds really wonderful, right? It sounds like God is saying that the church is really, really special, that you should be really proud of the fact that we're gathered here, that we are all of these things. Well, if you thought that, you would be both right as well as pretty wrong. You know, when we hear Peter say, hey, you are God's chosen people, it would be a mistake for us to read chosen in kind of like the way that the world chooses people in order to be a part of your community or not, right? We immediately think of, right, at least I do, think of like kids at the playground that choose teams, right? And when God chooses you because you are great. You deserve to be picked first is what it kind of sounds like. But Edmund Clowney, this great preacher who died several years ago, he would say that to be chosen in God's understanding in the Bible is not to be confused with choice. You are not the choice people. You are not like prime USDA meat or choice meat. It is not that kind of choice. But chosen means something very, very different that Peter is trying to get at, not in the sense that you were the best kid on the playground. But when he says that you are God's chosen people, Peter is using a deliberate Old Testament reference to the people of God, or to Israel. That all throughout the Old Testament, God continues to make clear why Israel is chosen. Look at Deuteronomy 7:7 with me. "The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to his ancestors." God's choice of Israel, of his people, is very clearly not because they or we are great and deserve to be chosen or deserve to be picked. It's actually the complete opposite. You know, back in those times, you know what made a great nation? You had lots of people, you had a lot of power, you had lots of land. Israel, and its story, was not that. Israel, of course, if you know, they were the fewest among the nations. They were the least desirable nation. Their entire story was that they were enslaved. They were captives. They had no power. They had no wisdom. They had nothing to offer to the world, but they were poor and outcasts. And God chooses them. And this is a pretty hard pill for us to swallow and to understand, that you are not special in the eyes of the world. And that makes you ask, well, why is it then that God chooses his people, chooses Israel? Well, it is very intentionally and deliberately to make clear to the world how he operates. And it is not by picking the prime choice people of this land, but it is to make clear that the way that he operates is through grace, in a way that makes clear that it is nothing of your own doing that makes you worthy or lovable, but it is all in God's hands. It is all about what he has done for you that makes you great. He doesn't want you or the world to confuse us doing something or having something with being great. He wants the world to see that the thing that makes you great, the thing that makes you wonderful, is his choice of you. And that is this running theme all throughout the Bible, because human hearts want to make ourselves great with what we have or what we can do. And God says, that is not how I operate. That is not how my community is built. Listen to what Peter continues to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He says this: God chose what is foolish in the world. Do you see the choosing part again? God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, the weak to shame the strong. God chose what was low and despised. He says that he continues to say, he picked the have-nots so that no one might boast before him. This is how God operates. This is the identity that he's trying to get clear. And for anyone here that considers themselves a Christian, it is not because we think we have brought something to God that we deserve, therefore, to be a part of his family. A Christian who understands the gospel knows that deeply, that we have nothing to brag about. But in fact, We're the last kids picked on the playground. We don't have anything of great worth to offer. And yet, not only are you a chosen people of God, but Peter says that the church is also simultaneously God's special possession. Now, the Hebrew word that this sort of derives from is this understanding that kings back in ancient lands that owned everything, had all the resources and all the things, would set aside their prized special possession, right, and would set that apart in order to separate it from everything else that they owned because they wanted to dote on it. They wanted to love it in a unique kind of a way. That's what it means to be a special possession of the king. And so what this passage is telling us is that you are not only chosen by grace, not because you can earn it, but you are also intensely and specially loved by God. God says you are special, not in the world's eyes, but in my eyes. That is a wildly different way to operate and to have an identity from the world. The world basically says, and our city basically says, if you prove yourself to be worthy, if you prove yourself to be lovable, funny, smart, intelligent, have all the things, then you will be loved, and then you will be included, and you will belong to our community. But that is not what Christianity says. It is not on the basis of anything that you have done that makes you worthy to be loved. I don't love you because you bring something to the table. It's not on the basis of what you have done. Instead, God says, I love you simply because I love you, because I promised to love you. And there is this circular argument idea of how God loves us, but you've got to understand that that is the ultimate, deepest longing of every single one of our hearts. We are so prone to wanting to prove that we are lovable, but that this kind of an idea, that he just loves us because he loves us, is mind-blowing. And it will only become beautiful the moment that you realize you can do nothing to be loved. This kind of love. This is the kind of love that you hope somebody would love you with. An unshakable, unfathomable love that does not change on the basis of your performance over the kind of life that you live or the kind of life that you have. When you understand this to be our corporate identity, a chosen people, and yet specially loved by God, that is what can make us an upside-down community of grace. Where it's not, you don't belong here because you fit in properly or that you bring something to the table or that you bring a lot of value and add to this community. That is not what is the basis of why we gather here today. The church, in particular, the Christian church, is not formed together on the basis of affinity or status or power or background or our likes and dislikes. That is why the church has always been sort of an enigma to the world, because it brings together people that you say, why are you guys in a relationship? This doesn't make sense. You don't fit the same categories as the rest of the world. My wife and I, we live next to the Paramount concert hall next to LIU, and every few weeks there's a concert there, and you can always tell kind of who's performing based on who's in the line. It's like everyone's like a teenager dressed in black with makeup on. It's some rock concert or something like that, right? That's not what the church is supposed to be. We're not supposed to look all the same and affiliate with one another on the basis of what the world says you belong for. That is a very different countercultural way for us to love and accept others, particularly outsiders and people who are different from us. And you can only get that, you can only be this upside-down community of grace if you've deeply internalized that your identity as God's people, your identity as his community, is on the basis of grace and on the basis of him loving you. That will make us this incredible community of immense humility. We are not better than anyone else in this world. There is no looking down on or scoffing at people, but instead, we are a people that move toward those who are outsiders in great humility, with an immense amount of confidence that we do belong, that we are loved, and that you won't be kicked out on the basis of your performance. That is the kind of community that the church is called to be based on its identity. But secondly, this identity comes with a distinct calling. The fact that the church has a lot of calling and purpose, has a mission attached to it, is one of the things that makes the church community very, very special. A lot of communities just want to gather together because we like each other. We feel safe. We want to spend time with one another. But church community, Christian community, gospel community has immense purpose and mission attached to it. And 1 Peter says that we are a holy nation and a royal priesthood that now declares the praises of God to the rest of the world. Let's unpack a little bit of what each of those things mean. When 1 Peter says that you are a holy nation, it does not mean that you are a group of people that is now morally superior than the rest of the world. We are not. There are wonderfully moral people outside of the walls of the church, and we've got to understand that. But when the Bible uses the word holy, it simply means set apart and distinct from the world. And so what Peter is saying is that this community has the calling in order to live distinct and unique lives as a community compared to the rest of the world. It is to show the world that you belong to God, that you are living in line with His character because you are living under His lordship. That is what it means to be a holy nation together. That's why in verse 11 and 12 he says this, "Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us." This is not just about morally pristine behavior, but I love that he says live such good lives. It is sort of to live in an entirely different kind of a way that shows people and shows the world that there is another path toward life. What real, good, fullness of life actually looks like, a life that gives life to you and others. You see, again, we talked about this AI example, right? It offers this cure, but it ultimately causes you more and more death, more isolation, more separation. That's often what the promises of the world or the solutions of the world leads to. You think it's going to be healing, but it leads you more and more toward death. And when he says to live holy lives, it's sort of saying, understand that living in obedience to God, living the way that He has called you to live, is the path toward life, real life, the kind of life that our world, our city, and our communities need. They need that. That's what it means to be a holy nation. But he goes on further and says, you are a royal priesthood. You are a royal priesthood. He's calling every single one of you pastors. You realize that? If you're like running from ministry, you're like, I will never become a pastor or a priest. Well, guess what? The Bible actually says all of us are. And what does a priest fundamentally do? What is it that I feel like I'm called to do? A priest simply mediates a relationship between people and God. That's simply what it does. It helps mediate. It helps to bring people to know and into a relationship with God, because in that relationship with God can be healing and freedom, the fullness of life. Forgiveness is found. Priests help to reconcile the world to God and to bring the world into a healing relationship with Him. See, there is this incredible purpose and mission and calling for the church, that this radical new community is meant to now be a light to the rest of the world around you. You are different from the world in order to serve the world, for the sake of the world. We are now to invade the world by living out the gospel in our communal lives together. That's the calling. Why? Well, just look around. The world is desperate for a community that shows healing and life and forgiveness. The world is full of brokenness, darkness, pain, and injustice, where people are isolated, where people do need companionship and friendship, where people do desire and long for a deep belonging in a life-giving community. And so the church, we are meant to commit to one another in such a way that shows and welcomes outsiders in, for the wounded to come and be healed, for the outsider to be welcomed, for those who are estranged to find reconciliation and forgiveness, for the rich and the poor, people who are completely different, to share life together. And Christian community is even a place where enemies can eventually become family. That is the kind of community that our world is longing for. And so the church, Christian community, is the healing and reconciling love of God that is meant to be visible to the world and available to the world. Now, I always think of this interaction that I had with a comedian here in New York City. She was a Christian, and she told me about this interaction with the comedy club owner, right? The owner was like, oh my gosh, like why, this world is typically pretty cynical, the stand-up comedy world. It's very cutthroat, it's hard, it's gritty. And this person who was a Christian was always just so full of hope and joy and genuine kindness and loving and serving other people and other comics. And the owner was like, why are you like this? This doesn't make sense. Why are you like this? And then this comedy owner spent time with more Christians, her friends, people in her church, and she said, oh, you're all like this. And it wasn't just this one-off person, but the fact that it was this community that brought so much hope and light. It became this incredible witness to this comedy club owner. See, there is so much purpose. God is using the church as his main vehicle to make himself known and to help others know that healing and renewal is found in him, that true life is found in him. There is incredible mission and purpose to our shared lives together where we are now invited to participate in the healing and renewal work that God intends to do in the rest of the world. But here's also what that calling means, and this is the part where it might get a little bit uncomfortable for us. That therefore, we as a community are not to insulate and prioritize and protect ourselves to try to keep what we have. But because we have this calling, we're now called to move out into the world, move toward those who are outsiders, and open ourselves up in vulnerability to welcome those who are outside this community in. And that's a really unique idea. Most communities either have really low standards, a really low bar, and yet it's open to everyone, right? Think about, the gym or whatever. You pay $15 a month and you can join, right? You're a part of that thing. Other communities have very high standards. Well, you can't get into the Yale Club or the Amex Platinum, whatever club, unless you can do X, Y, Z, right? So a lot of other communities have very high standards, but therefore it makes it very, very exclusive. Christian community demands that it is a deep and intimate community with very, very high standards, very, very high standards of how you live and what you're for, while also being so open and inviting to the outsider. There's this Christian idea, the word hospitality in the New Testament comes from the word xenophilia. That means love of stranger. That's what hospitality ultimately is. And that concept is all throughout the entire Bible, that as Christians, you're now meant to have this openness to an outsider. And that is what sets Christian community apart. That now, instead of living like the rest of the world that is incentivized only to spend time, money, and resources giving attention to the people that will ultimately benefit us and make us feel better about ourselves or raise our social status, the church, in a completely different way, says that you are to open up your life and your home and your resources and your time and your money, etc., to the stranger, to the outsider, to the newcomer, to the person that probably won't bring anything additive into your life. Because that is the healing call of what the church is called to do. That is an essential call of Christian community, that you do not love those who can do something for you, but you do it in order to give others life. You do it toward those who can't ever do anything toward you. You seek to serve and give of yourself rather than serving yourself. And here's the thing, and our final point, that to do that, to give of yourself, to bring people into your community that can ultimately mess it all up, that is very painful and very, very hard to do. That's very, very hard to do. And therefore, we need a greater power in order to live that out. And in order to get that, look at verse 10. Look at what Peter says. He says this. This is who you are. This you are called to do. Why? Because once you were not a people, But now you are the people of God. Once you have received mercy, you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. The entire story of the Israelites, the people of God in the Old Testament, were what? That they were slaves. They were captives. They were outsiders. They had no status, no power, no meaning. They were complete outcasts, and yet God showed them mercy through his love and his saving grace, that God brings them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and he says, you are now my people. The God of the universe is going to call you my people. I'm going to give you a name. I'm going to give you a status. I'm going to now make you belong. Everything that your heart desires. That is a story of the Israelite in the Old Testament that God has done. And Peter is reminding them and us today that if you consider yourself a Christian, that is also your story. If you have received the gospel and what God has done for you, what Jesus has done for you, this is also your story, that you were also an outsider, that you had nothing to offer. You know, Christianity grew so fast in the first century, particularly among communities that were most poor and marginalized. Why? Because what the gospel offered, what Jesus was saying, not only his message, but in what he has done, it was too good to be true for people who had nothing on their moral resume, nothing in their worldly resume to ever make them acceptable or to belong in a community. And God says, I've come for you. I'm going to give you your heart's desire. I'm going to bring you into fellowship, something that you who are lost in darkness and unqualified to sit at the table with God, now get sweet communion, companionship with God of the universe and with the body of Christ. Why? How? Because of Jesus. He shows you his mercy, his loving, sacrificial love in order to bring you in to the community. Do you realize what's happening on the cross when Jesus dies? We don't just talk about it because it's a sad point for us to remember, but the cross is ultimately Jesus being cast out to the outermost skirts of fellowship with God. He is ultimately rejected because he wears our sin, the thing that does make us offensive and rejectable from a holy God. And he pays for that sin on the cross. And not just that, but then he clothes you in his righteousness in order to make you God's most treasured possession. That now, because of what Jesus has done for you, the way that God, the God of the universe looks at you, is that he dotes on you. He's not disappointed in you and falling away. He's not measuring your performance, but he loves you with the love that you and I could never earn, and therefore a love that we can never lose. See, once you realize, once this becomes your story, that you were once a people not deserving of mercy, and yet you have received mercy in what Jesus has done, if you've experienced this kind of welcome and hospitality, this kind of communal love, then you can't help but go out. You can't help but move towards that are on the outside. Because all you can do is see yourself in the grace of God working in your life. How could you not love those who are outside of your realm? It is only if we as a community are founded in what Jesus has done for us as a community to make us this kind of community, will we then go out and move toward those in our city, in our neighborhoods who are desperate for community. And if we do that with this incredible mix of humility and confidence, our community will sing the praises of what Jesus has done. We'll be declaring and witnessing to his marvelous light and welcoming people home from darkness. See, every other community says you can belong based on what you can do for me. We must be, a gospel community must be a community that says, we are here for you, to be a church not for ourselves, but for the good of Brooklyn. I want to end with a couple of practical application tools for us, because now you might be feeling convicted about some of those things. But here's the thing that I want us to land on, a couple of application points for us. This means now you must give yourself to community. A lot of us think that we can grow spiritually or that we're honoring God and growing a relationship with Him because we come to church and maybe we pray every day and we read the Bible, right? But we are not in any kind of real community with other fellow believers. That you maybe just come here, you sit, and then you leave and you kind of think, well, me and God are good, but I don't know any of the people around me. You've got to realize that deep Christian community is now no longer optional. It is not an add-on to do when you are ready, because that means you don't know God. You don't know His purposes for the world and His purposes for you. The church is the vehicle. It is the missional vehicle for His purposes. You cannot know God apart from community. But also, if you're not in community, you cannot and will not change apart from community. You won't look more and more like Christ in your life apart from community. You know, when you read God's word and you listen to sermons, you can do all of that and you might think, well, I'm going to go ahead and apply this and then I'm going to grow. That's not how it works. Do you know how God grows the fruit of the Spirit in you, obviously apart from with the work of the Spirit, to grow you in love and patience and kindness and humility? Do you know how He plans to do that? By putting some real annoying, sinful people in your life where you have to show patience, love, kindness, and joy and hope. That is how we change. And when we do that, we not only draw on the power of the Spirit in us, but we point people to the fact that the Spirit, the gospel, can change us. And we become a witness also in those things. So friends, if you've been on the sidelines, if you're not quite in, I would implore you, join, commit, show up for people here. Don't just sit on the sidelines, but build relationships, grow closer together. And maybe community, you're like, I don't have a community. Well, be the kind of person that makes it. Be hospitable, make room, move toward those who are standing alone, don't have anyone to talk to. Move toward those so that we can be a community that ultimately shines the light of Christ from what He's done for us. May it be so. Let me pray.